I want to take up the issue of self-censorship to a slightly different direction by kind of introducing the particular regional area, the Korea, and just going back to Ada's question about fatigueness of this censorship giving on to the writers and others, and also Adrian's idea about the graduated expertise and readership that has to be really coming out from the whole realm of censorship. I want to bring that into some reflection that I've never done before. And just while listening to you, I began to really think about, oh, this is something that we really have to think in Korea part. I was thinking, what would happen to those people who really had years of self-censorship and then liberated? Then what would happen? What happens to the discipline and the learnings and the kind of resolutions that were really being solidated during the period if they had not been exhausted? But here I want to bring in a factor of individual versus collective idea and how the models of self-censorship has been actually being about individual basis so far, or minority basis rather than majority and collective basis. And colonial Korea gave a quite interesting kind of counterexample because minority was the Japanese colonial regime officials. The majority was the Korean public who were using Korean vernacular language and the conventions. And so, of course, during the wartime, when Japan and Germany and Italy were really winning, certainly there were people who were kind of trying to espouse what Japan is trying to kind of promote, and yet liberation take place. Those people who were most censored on the Japanese colonial regime went to North Korea under Kim Il-sung's leadership. And this interesting happened in kind of divided Korea, and I'm trying to think about how this self-censorship as a kind of program of training or discipline might have actually garnered different kind of reactions in different state formation in the divided Korea. So under Kim Il-sung's regime, the many South Korean intelligentsias whose writings were really heavily censored had quite a momentary kind of flourishing in the earlier phase of the state formation in the DPRK, we call the North Korea, but they will be purged soon. Kim Il-sung and his guerrilla groups were not part of the public sphere or printed word sphere. They were actually doing the armed struggle in Manchuria. And therefore, there's a certain kind of like conflict between the Soviet factions and Kim Il-sung factions and South Korean regional communist factions and the colonial factions. There are many factions. And then Kim Il-sung got the power. And so North Korea really went into very interestingly censorship department very clearly in the regime, and then that will be changed to different kind of form. In South Korea, I was just thinking, okay, so there are people who are collective self-censorship, and then how this would come out in a different kind of forms toward democratization after South Korea was divided from the North Korea. And I want to bring this one particular instance about kind of whose activities that have been still a very long legacy. The second, a very heavy instance of external state-led censorship was done in the 1970s and also early 80s. And at that time, a group of writers were censored and imprisoned and tortured. And the reaction was not individual-based, it's a collective. They were really trying to kind of form organizations, small and large, and clandestine or formal. They really kind of put the idea of civil society as a democratic. And I think the one particular publisher, it's called the Creation and Criticism Company, really played a very important role in this 1970s and 80s. And even the publisher itself was closed under kind of paramilitary dictatorship. But the reactions was that I think that it's not about author as an individual, but the publisher as a leader of the intellectual community. And then they really, these days, they survived, the company survived. But they were actually exercising this kind of Beth Anner's notion of the function of criticism in our time, like how to propagate the best knowledge in the world to the mass as much as possible. And I think right now, when there's so much inundation of information and knowledge and different ideas in Korea, how to select what is most important for the best form of civil society became a very important issue. Currently, it may not be precedented in any other countries in the world, but currently 2 presidents are now prosecuted, and 2 former presidents, and 1 president is going to be prosecuted. This is the result of a revolution that took place a couple of years ago. It's called the Candlelight Revolution. And finally, people just came out and said, okay, Constitution is what we really want to really observe. And it's before this nominal forms of Western modernity going on. But I think that many of the kind of trained, self-trained kind of reactions to the state-enforced pressures really met this real mass-scale revolution. So before, the government, especially the Park Chung-hee, the dictator's government, really had a blacklisting and obvious kind of the suppression of the publication of free speech. But the Park Chung-hee's daughter, Park Geun-hye, who was now in prison, they did whitelisting as opposed to blacklisting. So instead of like really picking up and try to suppress, they really chose who will be the ones that would give out innocuous or the kind of right-wing kind of things. So instead of really kind of using legal or administrative ones, financial ones. But again, between the state kind of fund kind of attribution and actual kind of administration really has a lot of cultural elements. They were using various family ties or this kind of various ties and really pressuring that only those people who would comply with the governmental kind of ideological ones will get the money. Mm-hmm. So finally, I think many people just realize that it has to be done. It's come to an end.
But I love this concept of thinking about collective self-censorship or group self-censorship in addition to individual self-censorship. I think we've looked a lot at how regimes try to project power and cultivate situations of fear or inducements of piety and reward, and thereby encourage a variety of self-censorship. One of the questions with which we began this series is the utility of reconsidering when we use the word us with regard to censorship and when we use the word them. Right? And an Orwellian model of censorship has an impersonal, distant them censoring us. And that it is sometimes very useful to think about the question of when is it us censoring us? And, or when is it us censoring them, as opposed to, where do we put the agency? And the question of collective self-censorship is a very interesting one. When you have the censoring authority, is that censoring authority thinking, we must make an apparatus to censor us, or we must make an apparatus to censor them? In some cases, it's easy to answer that question. In a colonial situation, for example, we can pretty much easily say the authority is thinking that we must censor them, that the us is the colonizer, that the them is the colonized. That's very uncomplicated. When it's a parent or PTA association, it's easy to say this is us, the adults, wanting to censor them, the children, or if you're on the other end of it, it's them, the adults, wanting to censor us, the children. But the authority is not thinking we're creating an apparatus to censor us. But I think sometimes the us is in there. And it's interesting to look for when is it, we've just had this revolution, we're good communists, we're trying to make sure that we're censoring us enough to keep the contamination of the old regime from being carried on by the fact that we grew up in it. Whether it's a member of the Inquisition or the Catholic Church who sincerely internalizes the idea that even that individual is prone to sin, and therefore is trying to come up with what is the system that will censor us effectively and protect us from the weakness within ourselves. I think it's very interesting to re-examine these different authorities and ask the question, is the person in the position of authority using us or them or some of each when thinking about who is being censored by the apparatus that they're trying to make?